Albert Einstein is widely credited as saying that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results.
I've never done that.
Never, no. Well, I wonder if Paul's suggestion in that reading that suffering produces such good things that we should actually glory in it might make us wonder if Paul was a bit crazy himself. After all, his experiences should have told him that suffering tended to produce not hope, but pain and misery. So why would he keep going when the sensible thing was to stop? We know that Paul was well experienced in suffering. And in his second letter to the Corinthians, this is what he says. He talks about being, if you like, in comparison to others. He says, I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I've laboured and toiled, and I've often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst, and had often gone without food. I've been cold and naked, and besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. There you go.
That was some
you can't argue with that,
experience.
as that's not a particularly happy life you'd have thought. And obviously Paul repeatedly endured situations which caused him harm. So why keep going? Well, there is a story that we've been following this week that we thought was quite a useful example of why keep going. And many of us would have been inspired this week too by the story of Sean Ash, who's a London ambulance service emergency call handler. And he suffers with a rare condition which must have come on quite suddenly because it was only diagnosed last summer, and it left him paralysed below the waist with little hope of being able to walk again. Not surprisingly, that diagnosis left him also struggling with his mental health, so that he couldn't see any purpose to his life. But after several months of pain and rehabilitation, he was able to walk about 10 meters. So he decided to try to walk 1 mile to raise funds for the service's charitable fund. And he called this fundraising challenge the Extra Mile, to reflect how tough walking a mile would be for him, and also to show his commitment to push himself to raise funds. Now, anyone who watched him walking with his Zimmer frame, I think it was on Friday morning, he did the last half mile. And you could see just how much effort it cost him. But he did it, and he raised thousands of pounds as a result. Well, we call that strength of character. And would you believe it, that's what Paul says is produced by perseverance. So maybe Paul isn't as crazy as we thought. Well, we could end there, but Paul goes on to say that character produces hope. And actually, in the context of Sean Ash's achievement, we can see that this is true, because his actions have produced masses of hope for everyone concerned. For his family, who thought he'd never walk again, for the NHS, which will benefit financially from his efforts. And actually, I think it did really trigger some hopefulness in the rest of us, because we saw through him what can be achieved in adversity. But actually, I don't think that Paul is talking about that sort of exhilarating hopefulness which happens when we've come through an ordeal successfully. Because no matter how fantastic our achievement, that sense of hopefulness, I think it's often only temporary. What Paul wants instead is to point us to Jesus, who endured the cross on our behalf. His sufferings were caused by our sinfulness, because God laid upon him all that we had done to destroy the relationship we were meant to have with God. Now, the good news is that this relationship has been restored through Jesus' self-sacrifice. But the not so good news is that we are still living in a sinful, suffering world in which illness, death, and pain are still prevalent. And this is bound to affect us, perhaps through our own lack of trust in Jesus and our own personal weaknesses. But really, it's just as likely that it will affect us because of sickness and bereavement, and in some parts of the world, even persecution because of our faith. I think that no matter how long we've been a Christian, the great encouragements we have seen in the past, which offered us so much hope, they can still be overshadowed by our current difficult situations. So the question is, where is the hope in that?
Well, perhaps the hope lies in putting the suffering into the context that, however bad it is still part of the journey, not the final destination. Perhaps that's why it's important to see that we move on rather than stopping. But then hope isn't our final destination either. After all, as Paul goes on to say in chapter 8, we hope for something that we can't yet see, don't we? We see in the COVID vaccines a hope for an end to the pandemic. Pauline and I hope to see our granddaughter again soon.
Very soon.
We all hope to be able to mix and mingle in each other's homes once more. We hope to meet here in the church on a Sunday morning again without any social distancing restrictions, and so on and so on. Perseverance and character in suffering do not just lead us to an amorphous feeling of hope without any idea of what we hope for. Hope, in fact, signposts us to the blessings that lie beyond our experience of suffering. I was struck by another news item on our TV screens this week, reporting the marriage in a Milton Keynes hospital of a young couple who were dangerously ill with COVID a couple of weeks ago. Of course, hospital weddings often take place when it's feared that all hope of survival is lost for one or other partner. In this case, the groom was about to be sedated as part of his treatment, with no guarantee that he would come out the other side. But I was particularly struck by what the bride said about the wedding, when she told reporters that the wedding meant everything to them, and that if we hadn't had each other and we hadn't been given that opportunity to get married, I don't think both of us would be here now. And so with the help of the hospital staff, including a friend of ours who's the lead chaplain there, the bride did not give up, nor did the groom. They persevered in the face of their suffering by doing something that lifted their spirits and actually gave them the hope of a married life together to live for beyond their sickness and suffering. So, what is the hope that Paul is referring to in Romans 5? What are Christians able to look forward to beyond whatever suffering we might experience during this life? Well, Paul summarizes it in just 5 words in verse 2, as he describes actually being able to boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. Sharing the glory of God. What does that mean? I suggest that it works on at least 2 levels. In this life, it means having God's image restored in us as he works to make us more like him. Remember, we were created in God's image, and we've fallen short of it because we've fallen into sin. In verse 5, Paul says that Hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. In other words, God longs to work in us to fulfill the potential for love that he's given us. And amazingly, places of suffering in our lives can be the very places where God works most profoundly, even when we cannot yet feel it. And as he does so, he shapes our character and helps us to live lives of love for him and love for each other. And the second level at which this works is it lies beyond this life. It lies in the ultimate Christian hope, expressed in the words of Revelation 21, which says that beyond this life, we have the hope and the promise of a life in God's presence where there is no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. But just as the hope of an end to the pandemic is based on the vaccines and on the past experience of previous pandemics, thankfully coming to an end, so we need a foundation on which to base the hope of our faith. This chapter, and particularly the reading that we had from it, is rich in Paul's understanding of the basis of our hope. Verse 1, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Verse 6, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. And verses 8 to 10, God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? What amazing statements of truth and hope on which to base our faith. So if this morning you're in a position of suffering or difficulty, I do not want to deny the reality or the depth of that suffering, that difficulty, that trouble. But I do want to affirm that those places of suffering are the very places where God, by his grace, loves to step in and give us a way forward, a way through our experience. And he does so, as Pauline said earlier, through Jesus coming and sharing in our suffering. But not only that, he defeated death, which lies at the root of all suffering, in order to give us the hope of new life with him, both in this life and beyond this life. And so, if you're struggling at this time, then take that tiny grain of faith that you still have left and persevere. Reach out to God and allow him to lead you through this mire towards the hope and the future that he's got planned for you. And if by God's grace you happen to find yourself in a better place than that at the moment, then why not be the hand of God reaching out to others who need the help he offers through you in order to keep on keeping on?
Well, our response song reminds us that persevering in the face of suffering is a work of God's outrageous grace, as we declare in faith that with God there is more healing than pain, more peace than trouble, more love than hate, and more grace than sin.